This is MIRMAs, a podcast where we sit down with guests of different backgrounds and expertise to analyze and hopefully understand current issues. I'm your host, Mathieu Lavault, sitting down today with James Skinner, founder and executive director at CANZUK International, to talk about Kanzuk, a cultural, economic, and political community that comprises Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. What can this community do for the English-speaking world, and will it soon become a reality? Mr. Skinner, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me on the show. I'm really grateful to be here.
Before we get started, can you talk a little bit about yourself, what Kanzuk is all about, and what the mission of your organization, CANZUK International, is?
Yeah, sure. A little bit about me. You can probably tell from the accent that I was originally born in the UK, in South Wales. Got very interested in Kanzuk when I emigrated to Australia a long time ago, back in 2011, and learned about the free movement and trade arrangement that exists between Australia and New Zealand. Emigrated then to Canada back in 2013, where I basically set up CANZUK International as an organization in 2015. And the purpose of the organization, essentially, in a nutshell, is to promote three common aspects between these countries, and that would be migration accords, whereby citizens can move freely between these countries for work and travel purposes. Free trade, whereby these countries would be able to establish free trade arrangements and removing barriers to commerce and removing tariffs. And then, of course, foreign policy cooperation. So that would involve enhancing the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and working with our already established framework that we have through the United Nations Security Council and other foreign policy formats as well. So really the whole Kanzuk concept is essentially to promote, closer diplomatic ties between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, hence the acronym Kanzuk. And founded in 2015, but so far it's gained a lot of publicity, and I'm happy to talk to you about it today.
And what I find fascinating is that Kanzuk has wide support in the Commonwealth as well as the UK, and we did not see this even 10 years ago. So what happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, when I started the organization and started really advocating for Kanzuk back in 2015, the amount of growth has been exponential beyond what I could have ever imagined. And I think really what has happened, especially in the last decade or so, is that I think through grassroots advocacy, political advocacy, lobbying, a lot of techniques essentially to really promote Kanzuk and the opportunities and the benefits of it has really just been very much done from a public and political level, to the point where people realize the benefits that it will have on their lives, regardless of what age group you may be, regardless of what political affiliation you may have. People see that Kanzuk is a real step forward. And of course, we've had a lot of beneficial factors happen as well. Here in Canada, it certainly helps that the leader of the opposition now, Erin O'Toole, is very supportive of Kanzuk. In New Zealand, it's been incredibly opportunistic for us that we've had the leader of the opposition there as well also come out in favor of Kanzuk. The government in the United Kingdom right now under Boris Johnson also in favor of Kanzuk. And then, of course, the Brexit vote back in 2016, that's opened up a wide variety of opportunities for the United Kingdom to explore avenues outside of Europe. So there's been a lot of cascading incidents and events that have occurred that have really promoted Kanzuk. And that tied in with, CANZUK International's lobbying efforts and speaking with politicians, diplomats, members of the public, senior cabinet ministers, all the advocacy work that we've done. It's all sort of cascaded into this momentum now that's building forward. And I think we'll really see Kanzuk be a real initiative in the future.
And what I find interesting is that, as you say, like there is the ancestral root in all these countries, but specifically in Canada, Quebec is different, right? Because it has that French history, but we still do find strong support in that province, correct?
We do, yeah. I mean, a lot of people think that Quebec is very French nationalistic and that's it, very Quebecois nationalistic and that's it, that they wouldn't explore anything outside of the French language. And that's a stereotype that I find is quite outdated today, because from our own polling, we've actually found that there's about 60% support in Quebec for closer ties, especially with migration accords with Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom. And even about 3 days ago, I believe the Macdonald-Laurier Institute published a report, which I encourage everybody to go on their website and read it. And of course, they can also go on kanzuk.com. We've also got a link to the article and an explanation about what it is. But that report also found that there was very close sort of feelings and mutual respect to Australia and the United Kingdom from Quebec. So the Macdonald-Laurier Institute actually polled Canadians to see which countries in the world they feel most favorably towards. And of course, Australia and the UK, unfortunately, New Zealand wasn't polled in this survey, but Australia and UK came out very positively, of course, because of the close affiliations we have already. But when it came down to province by province, it was British Columbia who favoured, who had the most favourable opinion towards the United Kingdom the most. And then in second place was actually Quebec. Quebec actually had the second most favourable opinion towards the United Kingdom of any of the other provinces, including Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Atlantic provinces. So this concept that, or I should say this idea that the Quebecois are very sort of isolated, I think it's certainly a sort of an outdated concept. And I do think Quebec, for example, does see the merit in promoting further Kanzuk ties.
Mr. Skinner, as you said, you're from England, but in the UK, there is obviously England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Are there any worries that Kanzuk itself there might be trouble for Kanzuk if, say, Scotland or Northern Ireland secedes from the UK?
Yes, it's a good question. I think obviously it makes things a little more difficult if that were to happen. Of course, it's a lot easier to negotiate Kanzuk when the UK is one singular union, as it has been really since 1801. So it's a lot easier to negotiate from a UK perspective when all four nations of the United Kingdom are united in that sense. Were it to happen that Scotland and Northern Ireland were to separate from the United Kingdom, yeah, it would certainly add a degree of complication. But at the same time as well, given that we've seen support across the United Kingdom, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but polling in Scotland and Northern Ireland has shown as well that there's significant public support for Kanzuk in those nations. So I wouldn't think it would be too drastic of an issue should Scotland and Northern Ireland secede from the UK. It does add a layer of complication, but at the same time, the public support is certainly there in those countries. So even though that complication would exist, it's all in likelihood, Kanzuk would still go ahead, even if it were to come to that.
And where does the foundation of Kanzuk come from? Because as you said, there are previous agreements within these countries.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of Kanzuk, I mean, long before I was born, but I believe the original coining of the term was back in the 1960s. And it was essentially coined to describe the loose affiliation and voting records of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom in the United Nations. And it was sort of generated as a term to jestfully play on the way that these countries used to vote the same way for United Nations resolutions. And I found it very interesting that, even back in the 1960s, these countries were very closely affiliated, not only in terms of culture and ancestry and history and, sort of political development on the international stage, but they were also closely affiliated in terms of the way that they voted in the UN. So for me, back in 2015, when I founded CANZUK International, I thought that, the term Kanzuk itself and the very meaning behind it had something more to offer the world. So instead of it being just a simple terminology that was thrown around loosely to describe the way that these countries would sometimes work together, I figured what better way to show how these countries are so closely affiliated than to really develop Kanzuk beyond just a terminology into something that really can relate to people on a personal, social, and economic level by enhancing facilitated migration, free trade, and foreign policy cooperation between these countries. So since the 1960s anyway, the term Kanzuk has certainly come a long way.
As you just mentioned, one of the big reasons is the flow of immigration. Are there any worries that there could be, say, an influx of immigrants from Canada moving to England?
It's a really good question. Short answer really is no. And I think what we have to look to in that sense is the current arrangement that Australia and New Zealand have right now. So Australia and New Zealand, many people might be unaware of this, but Australia and New Zealand effectively have a form of a mini Kanzuk between them, whereby Australian citizens right now can live and work in New Zealand, and New Zealand citizens can live and work in Australia under an arrangement that they have negotiated back in the 1970s called the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement, which effectively permits freedom of movement for those two countries. But at the same time, there are also caveats that one must not have a criminal record, one must not have an infectious health condition or have a terrorist affiliation, or be a national security risk in any way, shape, or form. And they sort of monitor this through the Five Eyes intelligence alliance that each of these two countries shares, along with Canada and the United Kingdom already. So if we look to that example, you are effectively talking two countries which have very similar characteristics with such as Canada and the UK, being that Australia has a population 6 times that of New Zealand, whereas the UK only has a population double that of Canada. But at the same time, immigration flows between those two countries have been relatively similar over the past 50 or 60 years or so. And actually, you'll be hard-pressed to find many Australians or New Zealanders who en masse really oppose the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, because it's certainly helped out both countries in terms of economic stress and recessions, and given each country and businesses access to an increased labor market pool. So it's been incredibly beneficial for both countries involved, and it would certainly be the same for Canada and the UK as well, granting that opportunity for citizens in both of those countries to live and work in those countries where they wish to do so, and businesses can employ and recruit from an increased labor market pool without going through the arduous process of the immigration controls that we have right now, providing citizens meet the current standards that are set by the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, meaning that if a citizen is a law-abiding citizen, does not have any terrorist affiliations, does not have an infectious health condition, does not have a serious criminal record, then of course they can move freely. So, as you put it, the concept of a lot of British people moving to Canada or a lot of Canadians moving to the UK, very unlikely to happen. And the record of Australia and New Zealand shows that, migration between these countries would be relatively equal under a free movement agreement.
And so I want to talk about the politics of it.
Sure.
Do you believe that Kanzuk has bipartisan support between conservatives and liberal politicians in these 4 countries, or that it perhaps slants more towards the right of center?
I would say, to be truthful, certainly right now, it is, I think it is slanting more right of center. And I think, we've seen that here in Canada. For example, the Canadian Conservative Party under Erin O'Toole have openly embraced Kanzuk. I think at their party convention back in 2018, Kanzuk was adopted with 97% party support from delegates. And of course, Erin O'Toole made it a specific part of his campaign when he's running for leadership. Of course, then he won. And ever since then, he's been advocating for Kanzuk since. Whereas from the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau, we've heard very little about Kanzuk. We've had a few MPs here and there from the Liberal Party who've express an inclination in favor of it, but, very little from the party front. And, that could also be described as well in the UK, under Boris Johnson, the Conservative government, they're very much in favor of Kanzuk. But the Labour Party itself, as official party platform, has been, advocating for it minimally. So I would say, though, that politically, I would say, yes, right now it is leaning right of centre. But publicly, I would say what's really good is that we have got it right down the middle, whereby publicly there are people on the right of center, the left of center, those in the center, all of whom support it because they see the absolute merit and the benefits that will come from Kanzuk. So, they see the benefits of having facilitated migration and the opportunities that can afford for work and travel. They see the benefits of trade, and they see the benefits of increasing foreign policy cooperation, especially with rising threats like China and North Korea, Iran, and other hostile nations to the West in that way. So we certainly have the support from across the spectrum in that sense. Publicly and politically, there is a little bit more work to do, but at the same time, that needle is slowly moving to the center. And I think the all-party parliamentary group that's established in the United Kingdom right now, specifically for Kanzuk, we're delighted to be an advisor on that APPG, and we are moving the needle towards policy in the UK for Kanzuk. But at the same time, that APPG has members from a wide variety of parties in the UK, and there are many. On that APPG right now, there are members from the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, even the Scottish Nationalist Party. So, there is certainly, whereas public support right now is very much in the centre for Kanzuk, there is certainly work to be done on the political side of things, moving that needle from right of centre to the centre. But we are seeing that shift happen, and the APPG in the United Kingdom, with support from all the parties in the United Kingdom, or vast majority of the parties, is testimony to that we are eventually getting it to the center in terms of a political perspective.
That's interesting. And do you think that the tie to the monarchy from the Commonwealth actually makes Kanzuk more desirable?
I think for many it does. I think obviously a lot of people in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK do have a strong affiliation and a strong support for the monarchy. There are many who don't, of course, but I think one of the many benefits of Kanzuk is that really, if you are supportive of the monarchy, then Kanzuk works for you because Queen Elizabeth II is, of course, the head of state. If you are, for example, not supportive of the monarchy, that's okay too, because the monarchy is not an essential ingredient for Kanzuk to work. For example, Australia and New Zealand tomorrow could, hypothetically become republics. And of course, the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement and the trade agreement that they have with each other would still function effectively and just as well, in the same way as security and intelligence measures between these four countries through the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance would still function tomorrow were the monarchy to absolve in a hypothetical world. So I think it does add that element of kinship between these countries. Like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK are united in some way by a head of state under Queen Elizabeth II, but it's not an essential component that the monarchy is there. So that also works for those who might have more Republican affiliations in the Kanzuk countries too.
And some of the opposition to the community say that this is based on Anglo-Saxon race or that it is racist. What would you say to that?
I wouldn't say anything really. I'd probably just laugh, to be honest. I mean, for me, it is a bit of a ludicrous argument to suggest that that the Kanzuk countries are, solely forming an alliance in this way just because of their race. To me, that's up there with any tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. I mean, for example, the European Union, as far as I've remembered, and the last time I checked, is a union of 27 member states, all of whom, as far as I can tell, have majority Caucasian populations, and all of them have Caucasian leaders. But nobody criticizes the European Union for being a racist conglomeration of nations, and rightly so. It's simply a group of nations who have like-minded interests and want to promote prosperity and, to a degree, a form of federalism amongst themselves, and it's nothing to do with race in that sense. So Kanzuk should be treated no differently. It is simply a union or an alliance of like-minded allies who want to formulate migration and trade accords and foreign policy accords for the betterment of their societies, whether that's through travel, trade, business opportunities, economic prosperity, national security, whatever it may be. So the concept of it being an Anglo-Saxon centric idea, I think, is a very narrow-minded and unintelligent way of looking at it. And it's also, I think, somewhat quite disrespectful to the other non-Anglo-Saxon races, and there's many of them in the Kanzuk countries who would also have benefits under this. For example, the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit here in Canada. Of course, you got the Maori in New Zealand, you got the Aboriginals as well in Australia, all of whom would qualify, to experience the benefits and the opportunities under Kanzuk. And I think simply labeling it as an Anglo-Saxon centric idea, I think is nothing more than simply an unintelligent argument that really does avoid all the benefits and all the reality that is present with actually, introducing a Kanzuk initiative in that way. So, how I react to it is really, half laughing, half just disbelief that someone could, ignore the facts in that way and simply promote such a preposterous idea.
And do you think countries like the United States or South Africa could ever be part of Kanzuk?
Really good question. And we get asked this a lot. It is absolutely possible, and it's a bit of a convoluted answer. So the reason that we are promoting Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK right now is simply because these countries are so like-minded and also very comparable in terms of economic and cultural and social affiliations. So, for example, the GDP per capita between these countries is very similar. Their human rights records are very similar. Their crime rates are very low. Their unemployment rates are very low. So effectively, you've got four nations who are very, very similar in a multitude of socioeconomic circumstances that would make Kanzuk work were there to be a free movement or free trade arrangement introduced between them. The problem is that when you start introducing countries like the United States, for example, the United States is a big problem for two reasons. One, I'm not entirely convinced the United States would really be interested in joining an alliance such as this, especially with a monarchy as the head of state, because the whole foundation of the United States, dating back to really 1776, is that they broke away from the monarchy and they wanted to pursue their own independent destiny. Right. So to say to the Americans, let's go back to a form where the Queen is your head of state, I think they would probably chuckle and turn away at the nearest opportunity. Whereas you have country like South Africa, as you mentioned. South Africa is a great country, and I myself have familial ties with South Africa. My fiance is South African, so I often visit South Africa, and I love South Africa. It's a great country, but unfortunately right now, facilitated migration or migration agreements with South Africa would open up a host of issues that effectively becomes a bit of a Pandora's box at this time. So for example, the crime rate in South Africa right now statistically is much, much higher than the Kanzuk countries. In fact, I think the murder rate in South Africa right now, tragically, is higher than all of the Kanzuk countries combined, something like 5 or 6-fold. So to offer free movement to a country where it's got a certain sort of domestic issue like that is a little bit risky as well. And of course, you also have to consider as well, a country like South Africa, the wage rate. I think in South Africa right now, the last time I checked not too long ago, wages in South Africa are about 73% less than what they are in the Kanzuk countries on average. So if you're, for example, working in South Africa as a doctor, for example, you might eventually think to yourself, well, why am I living in South Africa when I could get paid 73% more for doing the same job in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the UK? And then, of course, it's not just doctors, it's architects, it's mechanics, it's very skilled individuals then who then have that mentality and would then look to emigrate to, a Kanzuk country. And what that effectively causes is a brain drain on South Africa, whereby the best and brightest leave the country, and then South Africa actually ends up in a much worse off situation than if it were to not actually join Kanzuk in the first place. So it's a very delicate balance to sort of suggest which countries should join Kanzuk and which couldn't. Certainly I think the Kanzuk countries have it perfectly laid out, whereby they are so similar in socioeconomic circumstances that they would work under Kanzuk arrangements for facilitated migration and trade and so on and so forth. But to have countries like the United States and South Africa, even India, Singapore, other countries which on the surface might seem like good candidates, when you actually get down to the grassroots of these issues and look at the socioeconomic circumstances of these countries, there are problematic issues that arise. So if there was to be talk of other countries joining Kanzuk in the future, certainly those issues would need to be addressed. And of course, I myself as well would favor a democratic vote from the public of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK before any other countries were considered to join such an arrangement. So either that would be unanimous decision of the democratically elected governments of these countries, or even by a democratic referendum in these countries. I would certainly favor, if Kanzuk was to become, for example, Kanzuk Plus, I certainly think there should be at least some sort of democratic accountability to the people of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK before other countries are considered to join. But saying that, though, if there are other countries to join, there would have to be socioeconomic factors considered and addressed and rectified before we could even go down that route.
And so from CANZUK International, have you guys shown that these, if all these 4 countries were tied economically, that the GDP would boost in all 4 countries?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it would naturally do so just under the simple mathematics of economics, really. I mean, right now, just simply having, a mutual trading arrangement between these countries, you're effectively talking about 3.5 trillion US dollars worth of trade between these countries, with countries with a combined GDP of about 6.5 trillion US dollars. So to simply have these trading arrangements whereby you could reduce the barriers to commerce and reduce tariffs, remove quotas, certainly it would be magnitudinally beneficial for businesses, and also magnitudinally beneficial for businesses in the sense that they would have an increased labor market pool to choose from under migration accords between these countries. So it would certainly promote economic growth, certainly promote economic prosperity, certainly promote business opportunities, travel opportunities for working professionals. So, just by basic mathematics, I'm sure, actual full-time economists could look into it further and, confirm what I'm saying, but just on the basic, simple mathematics of, a CANZUK agreement in this way, the growth opportunities there economically are magnitudinal, as they have been really for Australia and New Zealand by imposing similar measures of this sort.
I want to talk about the difference between Kanzuk and the European Union, as you mentioned. It is not a political project, correct?
That is correct, yeah. So one of the things, obviously, I think contributed to the Brexit referendum, and I'm sure other people have different opinions about it, but from my perspective, I think one of the major contributions to the Leave vote in the Brexit referendum of 2016 was simply that a lot of the British public saw the avenue that the European Union was going down, in the sense that it was making advancements towards, as they say, an ever closer union, somewhat of a federalist state in that sense. And of course, that's been shown since the European Economic Community became the European Union, and since the United Kingdom joined in 1973. For example, what started off as a simple trading arrangement between these countries eventually formulated into, the European Union as it is today, adopting its own national anthem. It adopted its own currency. It adopted its own parliament. It adopted its own court system. It adopted its own centralized banking systems. So, of course, what we've seen with the European Union is this advancement towards somewhat of a federalist state. And, of course, only time will tell to see how far down the line the European Union pursues that avenue. But with CANZUK, it would be nothing of the sort. We at CANZUK International, we have always said from the very start that it would have similar aspects to the European Union in terms of promoting closer collaboration between these nations, in terms of free trade and foreign policy and migration. But at the same time, fundamentally and absolutely, from now until the end of time, I hope, it would simply be an alliance of like-minded nation states working together as independent sovereign nations. So there would be no parliament, there would be no centralized currency. They would effectively operate on the same circumstances as what Australia and New Zealand do right now, whereby they have these migration agreements, they have trade, they work together for foreign policy, they work for security and intelligence under the Five Eyes Alliance. But of course, Australia and New Zealand are independent sovereign nations. You would never say a New Zealander is Australian, and you would never say an Australian is a New Zealander. They are proud of their heritage, they're proud of their cultures, and of course, that should remain that way under a CANZUK agreement too. So by simply having Canada and the UK join on to, the agreements that Australia and New Zealand already have in place, it would forever function as independent sovereign nations who would have absolute control and negotiation power from a nationalist perspective, not just simply from a supranationalist perspective like what we see with the European Union. So there would be similarities with the EU, of course, but it would be monumentally different to the political avenue that the European Union is going, whereby these CANZUK countries would always be sovereign and independent.
And Mr. Skinner, to end this podcast, my question to you is, do you believe that CANZUK can be the beginning of a new social contract between the English-speaking world?
To some degree, yes. I think so. I think, obviously the fact that we are majority English-speaking does unite us in that sense. And it, of course, makes avenues for work and employment incredibly easy. For example, one of the hindrances that the UK had with the European Union is that if you want to live or work in France, then of course you have to speak French. If you want to live and work in Germany, you have to speak German. Latvia, you have to speak Latvian. But one of the major benefits for Canadians under CANZUK is that you can move to the United Kingdom or Australia and New Zealand and feel right at home as soon as you move there, as soon as you get a house there, as soon as you get a job there. That there's very little needed and required in terms of assimilation into these countries. And I think that's incredibly attractive for a lot of people in Canada. And of course, as well, throughout the remainder of the CANZUK countries as well. It just makes simply the CANZUK initiative so easy to implement, not only in terms of negotiating trade arrangements that we each share, the same majority language, but also as well that it's so easy to assimilate in these countries where members of the public to move. But as well, also, I think it's important to circle back on the original issue that, yes, it does help that these countries are majority English speaking, but there's also incredible benefits there as well for the Quebecois, who are French speaking. There's a multitude of languages as well all across the United Kingdom. Welsh being one of the official languages and widely spoken where I was born and raised in Wales. And of course, you've got Scots Gaelic, Skye Gaelic, Irish, Cornish, Manx. There's a variety of languages all across the UK who would also equally benefit under a CANZUK free movement, free trade and foreign policy arrangements. Same with Australia and New Zealand, with the different languages they have down there with the indigenous communities. So even though it is certainly, there's a wide variety of benefits for those who speak English, there's also a wide variety and an equal number of benefits for those who also have different first languages as well. So it's mutually beneficial for everybody concerned.
Mr. Skinner, thank you for your time. I really learned a lot about Kanzuk, and I think that many McGill students listening to this podcast will make it an aspiration of theirs to make this a reality.
Yeah, and I appreciate being on the show, and thank you very much for having me. And yeah, if you need me to come back and do some more podcasts, I'm always happy to. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Skinner. That's it for this edition of MIR Meets. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at McGill International Review for more up-to-date insight and analysis of global issues and international affairs.